Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change lives, and even open hearts that money could never reach. Ethan Caldwell was a man everyone in the city knew. His name appeared in magazines, newspapers, and business talks. People spoke about him with admiration and envy because he had built an empire of companies, and his wealth was counted in billions. But for all the stories that surrounded his name, very few people really knew him. To most, he looked untouchable, a man made of steel, someone who lived in glass towers far away from ordinary life. Yet behind all the shining success, Ethan was simply a father who carried a heavy weight inside his heart every time he looked at his only son, Lucas. Lucas was not like other boys his age, born with a condition that left him bound to a wheelchair. His childhood was filled with hospitals, therapy sessions, quiet days where he spent more time observing the world than being part of it. While other kids played soccer in the streets or ran around carefree, Lucas had to watch from the sidelines. It wasn't that he lacked spirit. His eyes always carried a spark. But his body did not cooperate with his dreams. Ethan tried his best to provide for him state-of-the-art medical care, the best doctors, the most advanced equipment. But what Ethan did not realize was that his son needed something money could never buy: connection, joy, and a sense of belonging. He loved his son deeply, but his way of showing it was hidden behind gifts and resources rather than presence and warmth. That morning, however, things began to shift in a way Ethan could not have predicted. It was a cool Saturday afternoon when Ethan decided to take Lucas out for lunch. Usually they stayed home, or when they did go out, it was mostly for medical appointments. But on this day, Ethan wanted to do something different, something normal, something like other fathers and sons did. So, he arranged for them to dine at one of the city's most elegant restaurants. The restaurant had high ceilings, large glass windows that welcomed the sunlight, and a soft golden glow from chandeliers. Classical music played in the background, giving the room a calm and graceful feel. White tablecloths stretched across every table, and waiters moved smoothly, balancing trays with polished dishes. It was the kind of place where people spoke softly and enjoyed long, slow meals. Ethan entered with Lucas, guiding the wheelchair through the wide entrance. As always, people turned to look not because of Ethan's fame, but because of Lucas. Some gazes were kind, others curious, and a few were filled with pity. Ethan had grown used to those stares, but he hated them all the same. He wished the world would see his son not as someone broken, but as someone whole, intelligent, and worthy of respect. Lucas, on the other hand, usually lowered his eyes whenever he noticed people staring. He preferred to disappear into silence rather than draw attention. The hostess greeted them politely and led them toward their reserved table. Just as they reached it, a young waitress named Mia stepped forward with a welcoming smile. She looked no older than her early 20s, with a warmth in her eyes that instantly made people feel comfortable. Her uniform was simple, but she carried herself with a grace that didn't belong to the job alone. It was something natural, something in her spirit. "Good afternoon," she said softly, leaning slightly to make eye contact with Lucas rather than only speaking to Ethan. That small detail made Ethan pause. Many people, even professionals, often ignored Lucas and addressed only him. But this waitress had chosen differently. Lucas gave the smallest nod, his lips twitching as if he wanted to smile, but wasn't sure if he should. Mia noticed his glance shifting to the corner of the dining hall, where a golden harp stood. It was tall and elegant, strings shimmering under the soft light. It wasn't being played at the moment, but its presence filled the room with quiet beauty. Lucas's eyes lingered on it, and for the first time since he had entered, they seemed alive with curiosity. "You like the harp?" Mia asked gently, her voice lowering so only Lucas could hear. Lucas blinked and hesitated. He wasn't used to strangers speaking directly to him. After a moment, he gave another small nod. Mia's smile widened, and instead of brushing off his interest like many would, she looked at Ethan. "Would it be all right if I seated him closer to it? I think he'd enjoy the view." Ethan was taken aback, not because it was a strange request, but because no one had ever asked such a thing before. Most servers wanted their guests seated quickly and efficiently, nothing more. But here was this young woman, taking notice of his son's unspoken wish. "Yes," Ethan said after a pause, his voice unusually soft. "That would be fine." With care, Mia guided them toward a table near the harp. She crouched down slightly, so she was at Lucas's level, and adjusted the chair for him before helping Ethan position the wheelchair beside it. "There," she said warmly. "Now you can see it up close." Lucas reached out with a trembling hand, not to touch the harp. It was too far, but as if his fingers longed to feel the strings. He looked at Mia, and for the first time that day he smiled. A real one. Small but bright. Ethan, standing behind, felt something stir inside him. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen his son smile so openly in public. It wasn't because of him. It wasn't because of some expensive gadget or doctor's recommendation. It was because a young waitress had noticed what others ignored and acted on it with kindness. As Mia left to fetch their menus, Ethan's eyes followed her. He wondered who she was, what kind of person cared enough to notice the quiet wishes of a boy she had just met. He didn't know then that this small act of attention would be the first thread in a story that would change not only his son's life, but also hers, and even his own. The restaurant continued to hum with its gentle rhythm of clinking glasses and murmured conversations. But for Ethan, the atmosphere had already shifted. Something unexpected had entered his carefully guarded world, a spark of humanity, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life are offered not by wealth but by simple, genuine kindness. Lucas, sitting by the harp, seemed lighter, as if for a moment he had forgotten the weight of his chair. His eyes gleamed as though he could already hear music flowing through the strings. And Ethan, watching him, felt both gratitude and a quiet gratitude toward the girl who had noticed. And shame that he, his own father, had never thought of something so simple. The meal had not yet begun, but the story had. A billionaire, his son, and a waitress 3 lives crossing paths in a way none of them could have imagined. And all because one person had cared enough to see what others did not. Mia returned to their table with 2 menus in her hands, but her eyes kept going back to Lucas. She had seen many families come and go from the restaurant, people in suits, couples celebrating anniversaries, children running around and causing trouble. But something about this boy touched her in a way she could not explain. Maybe it was the quiet way he looked at the world. Maybe it was the way his father stood behind him like a wall, strong but somehow distant. What she knew for sure was that Lucas's eyes when he looked at the harp had stayed with her as she placed the menus in front of them. She leaned slightly closer to Lucas again. "Do you want to hear it?" she asked softly, tilting her head toward the harp. Lucas blinked at her, surprised, and then nodded shyly. Mia's heart warmed at his response. She knew the harp was not just a decoration. Sometimes in the evenings, a musician came to play it for guests. Silently, strings waiting to be touched. She thought for a moment and then smiled. "You know, it's very gentle. You don't need to play a song to enjoy it. Just touching the strings makes a beautiful sound." Lucas's eyes grew wide, filled with a quiet kind of hope. Ethan, sitting down across from him, noticed this and raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to seeing his son open up so quickly to anyone, let alone a stranger. Would it be possible? Ethan asked, his voice cautious. He wasn't sure if the restaurant would allow such a thing. Mia glanced toward the manager's desk. She had worked there long enough to know which rules mattered and which didn't. And she knew for certain that letting a boy in a wheelchair touch the strings of an unused harp would not harm anyone. She gave a confident nod. "I think we can make it happen." She returned a moment later, pushing a chair aside and gently making space near the harp. "Would you like to come closer?" she asked Lucas, his cheeks flushed as he nodded again. Ethan stood to help, but Mia was already crouching beside Lucas's wheelchair, her voice calm and patient. "We'll move slowly, okay? I'll guide." The chair. Lucas's hands tightened on the armrests, but he allowed her to steer him toward the harp. Every bump on the wooden floor seemed louder in his ears, but the anticipation of what was ahead pushed away the nerves. When they finally stopped beside the instrument, Mia kneeled again so she was at his eye level. "You're right here now," she said softly. "Do you want to try touching it?" Lucas's hand trembled as he lifted it. For a moment, he hesitated, afraid he might do something wrong. Mia noticed his fear and gave him an encouraging smile. "There's no wrong way," she whispered. "Just one string at a time." With that reassurance, Lucas's fingers brushed lightly against one of the golden strings. A soft note rang out, gentle but clear, and his whole body froze. It was as though the sound carried through him, something alive and magical. He tried again, pressing a little harder this time. And another note floated into the air. A smile spread across his face, small at first, then wider, filling his eyes with light. He pressed another string, and another, creating a scattered melody of simple tones. To him, it was not just noise. It was freedom. For once, he was not a boy trapped in a chair. He was a boy making music. Ethan, watching from the table, felt his throat tighten. He had spent millions of dollars on therapies, equipment, and machines, yet none of them had brought this kind of joy to his son's face. And here was a waitress, with nothing but kindness and instinct, giving Lucas something priceless. Mia clapped softly after a few notes. "See, you're already making music," she said warmly. Lucas laughed, a soft, breathy sound that Ethan hadn't heard in a long time. It wasn't forced, it wasn't polite. It was pure happiness. The restaurant was not loud at that hour, but a few guests turned their heads to watch. Some smiled, some whispered, but Mia ignored them. Her attention was on Lucas alone, making sure he felt safe and not self-conscious. "You know," she said, "the harp is special because even a single string can sound beautiful. It doesn't need to be perfect to make people feel something." Lucas looked at her, his eyes shining, and then returned to the strings. He played a few more, experimenting with low and high notes. His fingers were clumsy, but every sound filled the space around him with gentle music. Ethan stood there, unable to look away, as though he was seeing his son for the first time. When Lucas finally let his hand drop, his chest was rising and falling quickly, almost like he had been running. He looked up at Mia with an expression. Ethan could not describe something between gratitude and wonder. "You did amazing," Mia said, her voice soft, like she was sharing a secret. Lucas's lips parted, and for the first time that afternoon, he spoke. His voice was quiet, raspy, from disuse, but clear enough. "Thank you." Mia's smile deepened, and she gently touched his hand in response. "You're welcome." Ethan felt his heart twist at that moment. His son hardly ever spoke to strangers, sometimes not even to people he knew well. Yet this waitress had managed to bring out words he hadn't heard in so long. It made him wonder what else Lucas could do if only given the right chance, the right encouragement. Mia carefully wheeled Lucas back to the table, making sure he was comfortable before stepping aside.
How?
"I'll bring your food shortly," she said, standing up again, though her eyes lingered on Lucas, as though she didn't want to leave. As she walked away, Lucas's gaze followed her until she disappeared into the kitchen. Ethan noticed and leaned closer to his son. "You liked that, didn't you?" he asked gently. Lucas nodded, still smiling faintly, his fingers tapping on the table as though they wanted to keep playing. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. He was grateful for the joy Mia had brought to his son, but at the same time, he felt a deep ache. Why had it taken a stranger to show Lucas something so simple? Why had he, with all his wealth and resources, never thought to put his son near an instrument, never thought that maybe music could bring him alive? The meal arrived soon after, but the food was no longer the focus. Lucas picked at his plate absent-mindedly, his eyes still glowing, lost in the memory of the strings he had touched. Ethan ate slowly, watching his son, realizing that something had shifted in their world. It was just a harp, just a few notes, just a waitress who cared enough to notice. But in that small moment, Ethan understood something he had forgotten long ago. Happiness was not always in grand gestures or expensive things. Sometimes it was in the smallest acts of kindness, in the willingness of a stranger to see what others ignored. Lucas, for the rest of the meal, hummed softly under his breath, almost like he was trying to recreate the sound of the harp. Ethan listened, his heart heavy, but also lighter than it had been in years. And he knew without doubt that this afternoon had changed something important, something lasting. Ethan sat at the table, pretending to study the menu, but his mind was far away. He kept glancing at his son, who was still lost in the memory of the harp. Lucas's fingers tapped lightly on the table, as though the strings were still beneath them. His face, usually so guarded, seemed brighter, softer, almost glowing. It was a side of his son Ethan had not seen in a very long time, and it both warmed him and pierced him deeply. For years, Ethan had told himself he was doing everything possible for his boy. He had spent millions on doctors, therapists, new wheelchairs, experimental treatments. Whenever there was a chance to improve Lucas's condition, Ethan had thrown money at it without hesitation. And yet none of those things had brought out this simple, pure happiness. It took a waitress, someone with no medical degree, no wealth, no power, to spark a light in his son with nothing more than kindness and a harp. The realization hit Ethan like a weight pressing down on his chest. He had been so focused on being the provider, the problem solver, the man who controlled outcomes with money and influence, that he had forgotten the simplest truth. Lucas did not need just care, he needed connection. He needed moments of joy, not only treatments and plans. Ethan suddenly felt ashamed, almost angry with himself. He stole another look at Mia as she moved gracefully between tables, balancing plates and smiling at guests. She looked ordinary in her uniform, yet in his eyes, she had done something extraordinary. And that made him wonder about her. Who was she really? What kind of person noticed the longing in his son's eyes when so many others had looked past it? As he thought about it, he also felt something he wasn't used to, jealousy. Not jealousy in the usual sense, but a painful awareness that in a matter of minutes, Mia had given his son something Ethan himself had failed to give for years. Lucas had smiled for her, spoken to her, trusted her. And Ethan, his father, had been a bystander in his own son's joy. He tried to shake the thought, but it grew stronger the longer he sat there. For years, Ethan had built walls around himself. Losing his wife when Lucas was still very young had forced him into a role he wasn't prepared for. He had buried himself in work, convincing himself that building wealth and security was the best way to protect his son's future. But along the way, he had distanced himself from the very boy he was trying to protect. Now, watching Lucas glow, because of a waitress's small act, he felt the full weight of his absence. Lucas broke into a small laugh, soft, almost privatese. He tapped out an invisible melody on the table. Ethan's heart twisted again. How long had it been since his son had laughed like that in his presence? He realized he couldn't even remember. The food arrived soon after. Mia placed the plates carefully, but she paused when she set down Lucas's dish. She bent slightly and whispered to him, "You played beautifully. You should be proud." Lucas's cheeks turned pink, and he looked down at his plate, hiding a smile. Ethan noticed how gently Mia spoke, how she didn't use the exaggerated tone people often used with disabled children. She spoke to him with respect, as if he were no different than any other young man. That, more than anything, touched Ethan. After she left, Lucas picked up a fork awkwardly. His movements were slow, but he was determined. Ethan reached forward to help, as he usually did, but Lucas shook his head firmly and gave him a look that said, "I can do this." Ethan pulled back, a little stunned. Something about that small refusal felt different. It was as if the harp had awakened a new confidence in his son. While Lucas ate in silence, Ethan wrestled with his own thoughts. He had always believed money could fix problems. If there was a solution, he could buy it. But here was proof that money couldn't buy what his son needed most. No amount of wealth could replace the spark of kindness Mia had given him. The realization made Ethan feel powerless, and he hated that feeling. He had built his empire on control, on bending the world to his will. Yet in this moment, he was reminded that life was not something he could always control, especially not the inner world of his son. He thought back to the many times he had been too busy to notice small things. The nights he had returned home, late, believing Lucas was asleep, when in truth the boy had probably been awake, waiting.
Wow.
The weekends filled with meetings instead of outings. The vacations that never happened because Ethan couldn't leave his business behind. He had told himself it was all for Lucas. But what if, in chasing a future, he had stolen the present? Lucas dropped his fork by accident, and it clattered on the floor. Before Ethan could react, Mia appeared with another one. Happens to everyone, she said kindly, placing it in Lucas's hand without making a fuss. Lucas gave her a grateful smile. Ethan watched silently, realizing again how natural she was with his son. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, no pity, just kindness wrapped in respect. Ethan's stomach tightened with guilt. He thought of all the times he had corrected people for treating Lucas differently. Yet he himself had been guilty of overlooking what truly mattered. He had treated his son as fragile, as someone who needed protection more than experiences. But Mia had treated him as capable, as someone worthy of trying, of touching, of exploring. That small difference had changed everything. As the meal went on, Ethan found himself lost in thought, his fork moving slowly from plate to mouth without much attention. Lucas was still in his own world, softly humming and tapping, as though he carried the harp's music inside him now. Ethan wanted to join in that world, to understand it, but he didn't know how. For the first time, he felt like an outsider in his own family. The feeling was uncomfortable, almost unbearable. But beneath the discomfort was something else, a desire to change. He didn't want to remain on the outside, wanted to learn how to reach his son, how to give him more moments like the one Mia had given. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted to understand this young woman too, the one who had shown him how blind he had been. The conflict inside him grew sharper as he paid the bill. He was a man who had everything, yet in the space of one afternoon, he had realized how little he truly knew about giving his son happiness. He felt guilt pressing on one side, admiration pulling on the other, and beneath it all, quiet fear that he had already wasted too much time as he helped Lucas. Back toward the car, Ethan glanced once more at the harp. Its golden frame shone softly in the afternoon light. He knew it wasn't the harp alone that had changed the day. It was the person who had noticed, the one who had cared enough to place his son near it. And as they left the restaurant, Ethan carried not only his son's joy with him, but also a deep question. What else had he missed all these years by not truly seeing? When the meal was finished, Ethan sat in silence for a few moments, looking at the empty plates on the table.
Ow.
Lucas was still smiling faintly, his fingers gently drumming against the edge of the table, as if the harp strings were still echoing. Inside him, it warmed Ethan's heart to see his son so alive, but at the same time, the weight of guilt pressed even heavier on his chest. He had not expected that a simple lunch outing would open his eyes to so many things he had ignored. As Mia returned to clear their plates, Ethan watched her carefully. She moved with quiet efficiency, her smile never fading. But he could see something beneath it now that he hadn't noticed before, a tiredness in her eyes. The kind of weariness that couldn't be hidden no matter how much she tried to appear cheerful. She was young, but there was something about the way she carried herself that told. Ethan, she had lived through struggles far bigger than her years. When she leaned closer to Lucas to ask if he enjoyed his meal, Lucas whispered a small, "Yes." That simple word, spoken so softly yet so clearly, made Mia beam. She touched his hand lightly, then straightened and turned to Ethan. "Your son is wonderful," she said warmly. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. Compliments about his son were rare, and when they came, they usually carried tones of pity or awkward sympathy. But Mia's words were different. They were genuine. She saw Lucas not as a burden, not as a boy trapped in a wheelchair, but as someone wonderful. After she carried the plates away, Ethan sat back in his chair, torn between curiosity and hesitation. Part of him wanted to leave it at that, to simply pay the bill and go home. But another part, the stronger part, wanted to know more. He needed to understand this young woman who had done what he, a billionaire father, could not unlock joy in his son with nothing more than kindness. When she returned with the check, Ethan looked up at her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried the weight of his thoughts. Mia paused, surprised, then nodded. Of course. Oh. Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. Why did you do that? Why did you... I'll take the time to bring him. To the harp? She blinked, almost startled by the question, then gave a small shrug. Because he wanted to. I saw it in his eyes. Sometimes people notice big things, but they don't notice the small ones. And sometimes the small ones matter more. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Answer was simple, yet it struck Ethan like a hammer. She was right. He had always chased big things, big solutions, big gestures, big plans while missing the little details that truly shaped his son's happiness. But Ethan wasn't satisfied. With just that, something inside urged him to go deeper. And what about you? He asked gently. You have a gift for this, for people. Why are you here working in a restaurant? Mia froze for a moment. The polite smile on her face wavered as though she wasn't sure how much to reveal. But when she glanced at Lucas, who was looking at her with quiet admiration, her defenses softened. She lowered her voice almost as if she didn't want the other tables to hear. I didn't plan to be here, she admitted. I wanted to study music therapy, something I've always dreamed about, using music to help people heal, especially children. But she hesitated, her eyes flickering down. Life doesn't always go the way you want it to. My parents passed away when I was 19. I have 2 younger siblings and they need me. I work here, and sometimes another job too. I try to keep the bills paid and food on the table. School had to wait. Her voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the quiet pain beneath it. It was not a story of complaint. It was a story of resilience. She wasn't telling it for pity. She was telling it because he had asked, and she had chosen to be honest. Ethan felt something stir in his chest. He had met countless people and businessmen and women who bent the truth, who exaggerated, who painted themselves as victims or heroes. But Mia was different. She was real. She had no wealth, no luxury, no powerful connections, and yet she had a strength he rarely saw in the people who surrounded him. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. He simply looked at her, trying to take in what he had just learned. Here was a girl who had lost so much, who carried responsibilities far beyond her age, and yet she had not grown bitter. Instead, she had chosen kindness. She had chosen to notice his son to give him joy. Even though no one expected it of her, Lucas, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. His voice was soft, but his words carried weight. You should play the harp too, Mia turned to him, her eyes widening. Then she laughed lightly, though there was a trace of sadness in her tone. Maybe one day, she said. Right now, I just listen. Ethan watched the exchange, his heart heavy with emotions he couldn't quite name. Admiration, guilt, inspiration, and something else too. A spark of responsibility. Not the kind of responsibility he felt as a businessman or even as a father, but something deeper. Sense that he had been given a chance to do something meaningful, not just for his son, but for this young woman who had given without asking for anything in return. When Mia walked away again, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about the countless donations he had made to charities, the foundations he had funded, the schools and hospitals that carried his name. But never before had he felt so certain that his money could truly change a life, not by building something with his name on it, but by lifting someone who deserved it. He looked at Lucas, who was still smiling faintly. She's special, isn't she? Ethan asked. Lucas nodded without hesitation. Yes. That single word carried all the truth Ethan needed as they prepared to leave. Ethan found himself making a decision he hadn't planned. He would not let this moment end here. Mia's story had touched him, and her kindness had awakened something in his son. This was not coincidence, it was an opportunity. He wanted to know more, to understand her better, and most of all, to find a way to help. Not out of pity, but out of respect. As they headed toward the door, Mia walked with them, thanking them for visiting. Ethan paused, looking her straight in the eyes. Mia, he said, his tone gentle but firm. I'd like to speak with you. Again, when you're not working. I think we can help each other." Her eyes widened in surprise, and she glanced between Ethan and Lucas, unsure of what he meant. But something in his voice told her it was genuine. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said softly. Ethan gave a small smile, one that felt different from the polished smiles he used in business meetings. This one was real. As he guided Lucas outside, Ethan felt a shift inside him. For years, he had been a man who measured life in profits, deals, and achievements. But today, he had discovered something far greater. He had seen what kindness could do. He had seen what it meant to notice the small things. Now he was determined not just to be a better father, but to use what he had to transform the life of the young woman who had changed his son's world in a single afternoon. And, for the first time in years, Ethan felt hope. Not the kind that came from money or power, but the kind that came from the heart. A week passed after that lunch, but the memory of it stayed alive in Ethan's mind. He could not forget the sight of Lucas touching the harp, his smile glowing with a light Ethan hadn't seen in years. He also could not forget Mia's quiet strength and the story she had shared about her life. In his busy world of business meetings, deals, and constant pressure, her honesty had stood out like a clear note in the middle of noise. Every night, Ethan found himself replaying that afternoon. He thought about Lucas's laughter, about the way his son had spoken to Mia when he rarely spoke to anyone. He thought about Mia's words, how she had put her own dreams aside for her siblings. And the more he thought, the stronger his decision became. He could not let things end there. He had the power to help her, and he would. One morning, as Lucas sat by the window at home, Ethan walked in, holding a letter. He placed it in front of his son and said, "This is for her." Lucas tilted, his head curious, and slowly opened the envelope with Ethan's help. Inside was a scholarship certificate and official document from the Caldwell Foundation. It's offering to cover all expenses for Mia's studies in music therapy. Lucas's eyes widened. "For Mia?" he asked softly. "Yes," Ethan said. "She gave you something no money could buy. It's time I give her the chance to follow her dream. It's not as charity, but as recognition. She deserves it." Lucas smiled, a proud and happy smile, and nodded. It was his silent way of saying he agreed. Completely. That afternoon, Ethan and Lucas returned to the restaurant. Mia was surprised to see them again so soon. She walked over, wiping her hands nervously on her apron, but her smile was as warm as ever. "You came back," she said brightly, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "We did," Ethan replied. "But not just for lunch." He pulled out the envelope and handed it to her. "This is for you." Mia looked confused. She slowly opened it, her hands trembling. As her eyes moved over the words, she froze. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she looked up, her lips parted in shock. This can't be real," she whispered. "It is," Ethan said firmly. "It's a full scholarship. You'll be able to study music therapy, just like you wanted. You won't have to choose between your dream and your responsibilities anymore." Tears filled Mia's eyes, and she quickly blinked them away, shaking her head. "I can't accept this. It's too much. I don't even know how to thank you." "Already have," Ethan said softly. He glanced at Lucas, who was watching her with shining eyes. "You gave my son a gift I couldn't give. You reminded me what really matters. This is not a favor, it's a way of saying thank you." Mia pressed the envelope to her chest, her whole body trembling. For years, she had carried the weight of her family, working double shifts, putting her own dreams aside. She had accepted her fate quietly, never expecting miracles. And now in her hands was the key to a future she thought she had lost forever. Lucas reached out with his small hand, tugging at her sleeve. When she leaned closer, he whispered, "You helped me smile. Now it's your turn." That simple sentence broke the last of her resistance. Tears rolled down her cheeks freely, but her smile was wide and full of hope. She crouched down to Lucas's level and hugged him gently. "Thank you," she whispered back. From that day forward, everything began to change. Mia enrolled in her music therapy program, supported fully by the scholarship. At first, She worried about leaving her siblings, but Ethan quietly arranged for additional help for her family, making sure they had what they needed while she studied. He never announced it, never asked for thanks. He simply ensured she had the chance to focus on her dream without fear. But that was not all. Ethan also asked Mia to spend a few hours each week with Lucas, not as a waitress, but as a companion. He wanted Lucas to keep exploring music, to keep building the confidence she had awakened in him. Mia agreed eagerly, and soon she became a regular visitor at the Caldwell home. Those visits transformed Lucas. He began to open up more, speaking in longer sentences, expressing his thoughts with a spark that had been missing for so long. With Mia's encouragement, he started experimenting with instruments, small keyboards, chimes, and eventually a harp of his own, which Ethan purchased after seeing his son's growing passion. Every time Mia came, the house filled with music. Sometimes it was simple, clumsy notes, but to Ethan, it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He often stood quietly at the doorway, watching his son laugh, watching Mia guide him with patience and warmth, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. But the change was not only in Lucas, it was in Ethan too. He began to step away from his business empire more often, choosing to spend time with his son instead of endless meetings. He learned to sit beside Lucas, to listen, to laugh, to notice the small details he had ignored before. The walls he had built around himself slowly came down, replaced by moments of connection. One evening, as Lucas played a gentle tune on his harp with Mia sitting beside him, Ethan realized something profound. All his wealth, all his success, all the towering buildings with his name on them, none of it mattered as much as this simple moment, his son smiling, his home filled with music, and the knowledge that he was finally present where it truly counted. For Mia, her life transformed in ways she had never imagined. She excelled in her studies, driven by passion and fueled by gratitude. She often told her professors about Lucas, how he was her inspiration, how his smile reminded her why music therapy mattered. Her siblings, too, were proud of her, cheering her on as she worked toward her dream. Years later, when Mia graduated with honors, Ethan and Lucas sat proudly in the audience. Lucas clapped with all his strength, his smile brighter than ever, while Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He thought about the day they first met her, a waitress in a simple restaurant, and how that single act of kindness had changed all their lives. For Mia, the scholarship had opened a door. But for Ethan and Lucas, her compassion had opened a far greater one, the door to love, connection, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest treasures in life come from the simplest acts of kindness. Ethan knew then that this was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Not just buildings, not just wealth, but lives touched, hearts lifted, and moments of joy created where there had once been silence. And it had all begun with a boy, a harp, and a waitress who cared enough to notice.